Lesson 5, American History, International Wars. This lesson explains the more important international wars fought by the United States in the 1800s and 1900s. This lesson is divided into 5 sections. International Wars, Section 1. We will now begin the first section of Lesson 5. The United States fought several international wars in the 1800s. The wars were fought for several reasons, including to expand U.S. territory, increase regional influence, establish international borders, and defend national sovereignty. The first international war of the 1800s was the War of 1812. This was the first time America declared war on another nation. The war took place in the U.S. and Canada and was fought against Great Britain and several American Indian tribes. Origins of the War of 1812 go back to at least 1803. In 1803, Britain and France went to war. America quickly declared its neutrality and continued to trade with both countries. However, Britain did not want the U.S. trading with their enemy, and therefore blockaded American ports to prevent ships from entering or leaving. In addition, the British often stopped American ships and forced American sailors into the British Navy. Another cause of the War of 1812 was American expansionism. Americans had been expanding west since before the Revolutionary War. However, in 1803, there was a major change in the United States. The leader of France at this time was Napoleon Bonaparte. France possessed territory in North America, and Napoleon needed money for his war with Britain. So in 1803, Thomas Jefferson, the writer of the Declaration of Independence and third President of the United States, bought Louisiana from France. The Louisiana Territory doubled the size of the United States and gave the country full control of the 2 largest rivers, the Mississippi and Missouri. All of this led to greatly increased westward expansion and would also help bring the United States into its first international war. After the Louisiana Purchase, settlers quickly moved into the new territory. This expansion caused more conflict with Native American tribes and also concerned Great Britain. Canada was a British colony at this time and bordered the Louisiana Territory. To protect British trade in the area and to try to protect Canada from American settlers, Britain gave weapons to Native American tribes, including the Seneca, Shawnee, and Creek, and encouraged them to attack American settlements. The capital of the United States is Washington, D.C. In 1790, Congress approved the creation of a national capital along the Potomac River between Maryland and Virginia. The area was created as a federal district, not a state, and named the District of Columbia. At this time, Columbia was a poetic name for the United States. In 1791, the city itself was named Washington, in honor of George Washington, the father of our country, and the first President of the United States. 9 years later, in November 1800, the first session of Congress was held in the new capital of Washington, D.C. In June 1812, after several years of the British blockade and their arming of American Indians, President James Madison, one of the writers of the Federalist Papers, asked Congress to declare war on Great Britain. Congress agreed, thus beginning the War of 1812. The war was fought in the Louisiana Territory and Canada and along the east coast of the United States. The British even attacked Washington, D.C., and burned down the new White House and Capitol building. However, the war proved very expensive, and after 3 years, neither side was able to win a decisive victory. Also, after Napoleon was defeated in 1815, the British ended their blockade, and despite the U.S. invasion of Canada, Britain had lost no territory. All this made it much easier to end the war. As part of the peace treaty, the U.S.-Canada border remained the same, the British stopped supporting their Native American allies, and many of those tribes were forced onto reservations west of the Mississippi River. In addition to the burning of Washington, the War of 1812 is famous because it inspired our national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. The song comes from a poem written the morning after the British bombed an American fort. A soldier there, Francis Scott Key, was inspired to write the Star-Spangled Banner when he saw the U.S. flag was still flying over the fort the next morning. The song has 3 verses, but traditionally only the first verse is sung. The Star-Spangled Banner became the official national anthem in 1931. This is the end of Section 1. We will now practice the related civics questions. Question 67. The Federalist Papers supported the passage of the U.S. Constitution. Name one of the writers. Madison. One of the writers of the Federalist Papers is James Madison. The 3 authors of the Federalist Papers are James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. However, most of the essays were published anonymously under the name Publius. Question 71. What territory did the United States buy from France in 1803? Louisiana. The United States bought Louisiana, or the Louisiana Territory, from France in 1803. Question 88. Name one of the 2 longest rivers in the United States. Missouri. The Missouri River is one of the longest rivers in the United States. The other river is the Mississippi River. Question 94. What is the capital of the United States? Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is the capital of the United States. D.C. stands for District of Columbia. Question 98. What is the name of the national anthem? The Star-Spangled Banner. The name of the national anthem is the Star-Spangled Banner. International Wars, Section 2. We will now begin the second section of Lesson 5. The next international war of the 1800s was the Mexican-American War. The Mexican-American War was the direct result of American expansionism. What is now the state of Texas was originally part of Mexico. Mexico had only recently become independent in 1821, and Texas had a small Mexican population. The few Mexicans there were often attacked by Native Americans who already lived there, like the Apache and the Navajo. So to try to protect Texas, Mexico invited Americans to settle in the territory. So many people came that within 10 years, Americans made up 80% of the population. Mexico then tried to stop the immigration, but in 1835, the Americans in Texas declared independence. A Mexican army attacked, was defeated, and Mexico agreed to make Texas an independent republic. However, 10 years later, Texas asked the United States to annex the region and make it part of the United States. After some debate, the U.S. government eventually agreed and sent U.S. troops to Texas, which of course was still part of Mexico. As some people in the United States hoped it would, this provoked Mexico to attack again, thus beginning the Mexican-American War. The Mexican-American War went on for 2 years before Mexico was defeated. The peace treaty forced Mexico to give up Texas and to sell California and its other northern territories to the United States. Mexico was now half the size it was when the war began. For its part, the U.S. now stretched across the North American continent from the Atlantic Ocean in the east to the Pacific Ocean in the west. The last international war of the 1800s was the Spanish-American War. Cuba had been a Spanish territory since the time of Columbus. In 1895, a war for independence began. To try to maintain control, the Spanish forced many Cubans into camps in which as many as 200,000 people may have died. This caused great anger and concern in the United States. It was also viewed by some politicians and influential newspaper publishers as an opportunity to expand American influence in the Caribbean. Then in 1898, the U.S. sent the battleship Maine to Havana, Cuba. The plan was Americans would be able to evacuate to the battleship if the situation in Cuba became too dangerous. A month after arriving, a large explosion sank the Maine. While most likely an accident, many people blamed the Spanish, and the United States eventually declared war. The Spanish-American War was fought on Cuba and in the Pacific Ocean around the Philippines and Guam. The Spanish were quickly defeated, and as part of the peace treaty, the U.S. gained control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. To this day, Puerto Rico and Guam are still U.S. territories. U.S. territories will be discussed more fully in Lesson 11. This is the end of Section 2. We will now practice the related civics questions. Question 72. Name one war fought by the United States in the 1800s. The War of 1812. The United States fought several wars in the 1800s. Four of them are the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Civil War, and the Spanish-American War. The Civil War is not in this lesson because it is not an international war. Question 87. Name one American Indian tribe in the United States. Seneca. The Seneca is one of several tribes that fought with the British during the War of 1812. This slide has the name of 25 Native American tribes, including 4 others mentioned in this lesson: the Apache, Navajo, Shawnee, and Creek. You may pause the video to read the complete list. Question 89. What ocean is on the west coast of the United States? The Pacific Ocean. The Pacific Ocean is on the west coast of the United States. Question 90. What ocean is on the east coast of the United States? The Atlantic. The Atlantic Ocean is on the east coast of the United States. Question 91. Name one U.S. territory. Guam. Guam is a U.S. territory. The other U.S. territory mentioned in this lesson is Puerto Rico. The 3 other U.S. territories are the U.S. Virgin Islands, American Samoa, and Northern Mariana Islands. These will be discussed further in Lesson 11. International Wars, Section 3. We will now begin the 3rd section of Lesson 5. The United States also fought several international wars in the 1900s. The first war was World War I. World War I was fought in Europe from 1914 until 1918. The causes of the First World War are complicated, but include militarism, imperialism, nationalism, and military alliances. The major European countries had fought each other for centuries. However, by the early 1900s, relations were so troubled that a minor local event on the borders of Europe started one of the deadliest wars in history. World War I began shortly after the assassination of a member of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Ferdinand was killed by a Serbian patriot who wanted his country to be independent of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. After the assassination, tensions in Europe quickly grew, and all attempts at diplomacy failed to calm the situation. As a result, within 6 weeks, Europe was at war. The First World War began when Austria attacked Serbia in retaliation for the assassination. However, since Germany had promised to support Austria, Germany then attacked Belgium, France, and Russia. Shortly after, the Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria entered the war as allies of Germany and Austria-Hungary. This caused Great Britain to enter the war as well, because it had promised to defend Belgium. In 1917, while Russia was still fighting Germany, the Russian Revolution and Civil War began. This forced Russia to end the war with Germany, and eventually ended with Russia becoming the world's first communist country. Communism is an economic and political system in which the government owns all the property and industry and decides what will be produced, how much it costs, and who can buy it. In that way, it is the opposite of capitalism. Communist governments are also totalitarian, which means citizens have very few rights or freedoms, and no real form of democracy is practiced. In 1922, Russia's new communist government changed the country's name to the Soviet Union. In contrast, the economic system of the United States is based on free market capitalism. In capitalism, businesses operate in a market economy. Businesses in a market economy are publicly or privately owned and operated for profit. In a capitalist economy, what is produced and how much it costs is determined through free competition and supply and demand, not by a central government. Woodrow Wilson was the U.S. president before and during World War I. Like during the War of 1812, at the beginning of World War I, the U.S. declared its neutrality and continued to trade with Britain. Great Britain is an island nation, so much of what it needs is imported by ship. Therefore, Germany tried to use a new weapon called the submarine to stop trade with Britain and, in 1915, declared it would sink any ship it found near the country. A couple of months later, a German submarine sank the British passenger ship Lusitania. 128 Americans on board died. The U.S. then demanded the Germans end all attacks on passenger ships, but Germany ignored the demands and began sinking American ships as well. Germany knew this would force the United States to declare war, so they encouraged Mexico to attack the U.S. by promising they could gain back the territory they had lost in the Mexican-American War. Mexico refused, but when this offer became known, President Woodrow Wilson could no longer ignore Germany's actions, and Congress agreed to declare war on April 6, 1917. With the United States now fighting alongside France and Britain, Germany could not win the war. Still, fighting went on for another year until Germany surrendered on November 11, 1918. The peace treaty required Germany to give up territory and pay a tremendous amount of war damages. This hurt the German economy and caused great anger in the country. For these reasons, the treaty that ended World War I is now seen as one of the main causes of the next international war of the 1900s, World War II. This is the end of Section 3. We will now practice the related civics questions. Question 11. What is the economic system in the United States? A market economy. The economic system in the United States is a capitalist economy or a market economy. Question 79. Who was president during World War I? Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was president during World War I. If you are asked this question during your interview, you may answer with just the last name or the full name, Woodrow Wilson. International Wars, Section 4. We will now begin the fourth section of Lesson 5. In the United States, the 1920s were known as the Roaring Twenties. This was a time of great economic growth and cultural change. Throughout the 1920s, there was tremendous speculation in the stock market until 1929, when the stock market suddenly crashed. This crash led to the Great Depression, the longest economic recession in modern history. Within a few years, global trade had fallen by 50%, and unemployment in the United States reached 23%. The president in 1929 was Herbert Hoover. He was largely blamed for the Great Depression and lost re-election in 1932 to Franklin Roosevelt. President Roosevelt would go on to lead the U.S. through both the Great Depression and World War II. He would also become the longest-serving president in U.S. history. He died at the beginning of his fourth presidential term in 1945. In Germany, economic problems, made worse by the Great Depression, a weak government, and unhappiness over the treaty that ended World War I helped a politician named Adolf Hitler become leader of Germany in 1934. Hitler then quickly made himself a dictator and turned Germany into a totalitarian country, like the Soviet Union. Hitler was the leader of the Nazi Party, a political party with a very nationalistic and racist ideology. Nazis believed Germans were the purest race and therefore deserved to conquer all of Europe and the Soviet Union. As part of their beliefs, the Nazis systematically murdered anyone they felt were inferior, in particular Jewish people, but also homosexuals and people with disabilities. This is now known as the Holocaust. By the time World War II ended, the Nazis had murdered 6 million people, many of them in special extermination camps. World War II was a true world war. It was fought in Europe, Russia, North Africa, in the Atlantic, and throughout Asia and the Pacific. The war began in 1939 when Germany invaded Poland. Similar to the alliances that existed before World War I, Great Britain and France had promised to defend Poland and therefore declared war on Germany. The next year, Germany invaded and defeated Belgium, Holland, and France. This left Britain alone in the war against Germany. In addition, the defeat of France convinced Italy to join the war on the side of Germany, and, a few months later, Japan, Germany, and Italy created a military alliance called the Rome-Berlin-Tokyo Axis. Then in June 1941, the war greatly expanded when Germany invaded the Soviet Union. For its part, the U.S. did not want to enter another European war. It assisted Britain with weapons and supplies, although this help was limited by isolationist feeling in Congress and the United States in general. Still, unlike before World War I, American assistance to Britain did not create much tension with Germany. Even so, as a global power with a large navy and interests in the Pacific, there was increasing tension between the United States and Japan. For years, Japan had been trying to create an empire in Asia, but because the U.S., Britain, France, and Holland all had colonies in the Asia-Pacific region, the Japanese could not expand as quickly or freely as they wanted. However, with Germany's victories in Europe, by 1941, only the U.S. could still effectively resist Japan. This led Japan to take a gamble. They would bomb the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and while the U.S. was recovering, Japan would secure their empire in the Pacific. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. America quickly declared war on Japan, and soon after, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. The U.S. was now once again helping Britain in a European war. As allies, the two countries' armies needed a supreme commander. Since the United States would be contributing the most men and material, it was agreed that an American should be commander. General Dwight D. Eisenhower was chosen as supreme commander because he was diplomatic and understood the political challenges of wartime leadership. After World War II, Eisenhower retired from the Army, and 7 years later, during the Korean War, he would be elected as the 34th President of the United States. In World War II, the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union fought against Germany, Japan, and Italy. Italy was defeated in 1943, but Germany and Japan didn't surrender until 1945. After the Russian Revolution in 1917, the U.S. and the Soviet Union became ideological rivals because their economic and political systems were so different. During World War II, the two countries became allies, but when the war ended, the Soviet Union set up communist governments in the countries they liberated from the Germans. This concerned the U.S. and marked the beginning of the Cold War, a 45-year period when communism was the main concern of the United States. However, the Cold War was not a real war. The U.S. and the Soviet Union never fought each other directly. Instead, they competed for global influence, which often meant becoming involved in proxy wars. On the map, the countries in red show the communist nations in 1945. In 1949, communism became an even greater concern for the United States when China became communist as well. This is the end of Section 4. We will now practice the related civics questions. Question 80. Who was the president during the Great Depression and World War II? Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt was president during the Great Depression and World War II. Question 81. Who did the United States fight in World War II? Japan, Germany, and Italy. The United States fought Japan, Germany, and Italy in World War II. Question 82. Before he was president, Eisenhower was a general. What war was he in? World War II. President Eisenhower was a general in World War II before he was president. International Wars, Section 5. We will now begin the fifth section of Lesson 5. While the United States and the Soviet Union never fought each other during the Cold War, as part of the Cold War, the U.S. fought two major wars trying to stop the spread of communism. The Korean War was the first such war. Before World War II, Korea was a colony of Japan. When the war ended, Korea was divided at the 38th parallel into a communist north, supported by China and Russia, and a southern half, supported by the United States. National elections were planned, after which Korea would be reunified under the government that won the election. However, North Korea refused to allow elections because they had a smaller population and knew that they would lose. As a result, the country remained divided and its future uncertain. Then, in 1950, North Korea suddenly invaded the South. The United States and 20 other countries sent troops to defend South Korea. The U.S.-led forces soon pushed the North Koreans out of the South and all the way to the Chinese border. That caused China to enter the war on the side of North Korea, and together they pushed the U.S. forces back to the 38th parallel. There, the war quickly fell into a stalemate. For the next 2 years, a static war was fought, much like in World War I. The war continued until 1953, when a ceasefire ended the fighting. However, a ceasefire is not a peace treaty. North and South Korea are technically still at war, and the country remains divided between a communist North and a democratic South. For the United States, the greatest conflict to come out of the Korean War was the Vietnam War. By the end of World War II, Vietnam had been a French colony for 70 years. Shortly after that war ended, communist fighters in the north of the country began fighting the French. The Korean War had just ended in a stalemate, so when the Vietnamese communists defeated the French in 1954, the American government was very concerned. President Eisenhower spoke about a domino theory in which one country would become communist, then another, and another, until communism controlled the world. As part of the peace agreement with the French, Vietnam was divided at the 17th parallel into a communist North and a U.S.-backed South. As with Korea, elections were planned, after which the country would be reunified under the winning government. However, this time the U.S. and South Vietnam refused to hold elections because they believed they would lose. Therefore, Vietnam remained divided, and soon after, a communist insurgency began in the South. The United States began sending military advisors to South Vietnam in 1955. 10 years later, in 1965, the first American combat troops arrived. By the end of the year, there were 200,000 American soldiers in Vietnam, and by 1968, there were over 500,000 Americans in the country. The United States fought in Vietnam until 1973 with little success. By this time, the war had become extremely unpopular in America. Most of the American troops left that year, and 2 years later, South Vietnam was defeated by Communist North Vietnam. The Cold War ended in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. By the 1980s, the Soviet economy was very weak, and the country was losing control of its communist neighbors in Europe. The last Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, tried to save the communist system by giving citizens some economic and political freedom, and allowing freedom of speech. The result was a series of mostly peaceful revolutions that overthrew the communist governments of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. The most symbolic and famous event of this amazing collapse occurred in November 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down. Because of the importance of oil, both during and after the Cold War, the U.S. was also concerned about the Middle East. The U.S. fought its first war in the Middle East in 1990, after Iraq invaded and annexed Kuwait. The Iraqi leader said he did this for 2 reasons. First, after World War I, Britain had created the nation of Kuwait from the remains of the Ottoman Empire. However, Iraq argued that Kuwait had always been part of the country. Second, Iraq and Kuwait belonged to the group of oil-producing countries called OPEC. OPEC sets oil production quotas to maintain the price of oil, and Iraq accused Kuwait of both producing too much oil and drilling across their border into Iraq's oil fields. When Iraq demanded $10 billion in damages, Kuwait offered $9 billion. Iraq rejected that amount and announced it would invade. On August 2, 1990, Iraq invaded and occupied Kuwait. The U.S. was concerned Iraq would then invade Saudi Arabia. That would have seriously threatened the world's oil supply. The United States then formed a coalition of nations willing to liberate Kuwait. On December 17, 1990, the United Nations ordered Iraq to leave Kuwait by January 15, 1991. Iraq refused, and 2 days later, a U.S.-led bombing campaign against Iraq began. A month later, on February 23rd, the coalition army invaded and liberated Kuwait in 100 hours. This war is now known as the Persian Gulf War. After the Gulf War, the United Nations imposed sanctions on Iraq, and some American troops were kept in Saudi Arabia. The sanctions were intended to prevent Iraq from rebuilding its army or making weapons of mass destruction. However, some Muslims were opposed to the sanctions and did not like the idea of American troops in Saudi Arabia. Also, for many years, many people in the Middle East had complained about America's support for Israel. Together, all these policies made the United States an enemy in the eyes of many ordinary Muslims as well as terrorist groups. In 1993, a truck bomb exploded under the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. 6 people were killed and 1,000 injured. The terrorists responsible said they wanted the United States to leave the Middle East and stop all support for Israel. A few years later, Osama bin Laden, the leader of a terrorist group called Al-Qaeda, called on Muslims to join a holy war against America. Al-Qaeda eventually decided to attempt a large attack on the U.S. Planning took several years, and on September 11, 2001, 19 terrorists from Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 commercial airliners. 2 of the planes were crashed into the World Trade Center in New York City, and another hit the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia. It is believed the 4th plane was meant to fly to Washington, D.C. However, passengers attacked the terrorists, and the plane crashed in a field in Pennsylvania. This is the end of Section 5. We will now practice the related civics questions. Question 78. Name one war fought by the United States in the 1900s. World War II. World War II is one war fought by the United States in the 1900s. The United States fought several wars in the 1900s. 5 of them are World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the Persian Gulf War. Question 83. During the Cold War, what was the main concern of the United States? Communism. The main concern of the United States during the Cold War was communism. Question 86. What major event happened on September 11, 2001 in the United States? Terrorists attacked the United States. On September 11, 2001, terrorists attacked the United States. This is the end of Lesson 5.